The last meal I served on the Titanic was a bread roll, not the 11-course first-class dinner the newspapers wrote about for years after, not the turtle soup or the lamb with mint sauce or the French ice cream nobody in third class had ever heard of. A bread roll to a woman at table 7 who asked me very politely if she could have another one because the first one had gone cold. I brought it. She thanked me. I moved on to the next table. 20 minutes later, the ship hit the iceberg. I never saw her again. I have thought about the bread roll every single day since, whether she ate it, whether she had time, whether a warm bread roll was the last ordinary comfort she had before the world she was sitting in stopped being the world entirely. I brought it to her because it was my job. That is the whole of what I had to offer. My name is Thomas Burke. I was 23 years old and I was a second-class dining steward aboard the RMS Titanic on a maiden voyage from Southampton to New York, April 1912. I was not a passenger, not an officer, not an engineer who understood the compartment, or a wireless operator who heard the ice warnings coming in all day and did nothing useful with them. I was the man who brought you your dinner, and I was on that ship for 4 days, moving between those dining saloon tables with plates and bread baskets and wine bottles, close enough to touch almost every person whose story you have ever read about, and invisible to every single one of them. This is what those 4 days looked like from the other side of the table. I need to tell you what the Titanic felt like before I tell you what it felt like to lose it, because the tragedy has eaten the ship. When people say Titanic now, they mean disaster, they mean iceberg, they mean the wreck on the ocean floor. They have forgotten that for 4 days it was just a ship, the most extraordinary ship any of us had ever seen, but a ship. I came aboard at Southampton on the 10th of April. I had worked on other White Star Line vessels before and thought I understood what a large ship was. I did not understand what a large ship was. The Titanic was not a ship in the way other ships were ships. It was a city that had agreed temporarily to float. The grand staircase alone. I stood at the top of it on my first walkthrough and stood there for a moment, which we were not supposed to do. Staff were not supposed to stand and stare, but I couldn't help it. The glass dome above, the carved oak banisters, the chandelier catching light from every angle. A chandelier on a ship. I had grown in a house in Queenston with 4 brothers in 2 rooms. I had never in my life been in a building with a chandelier. I stood there for perhaps 15 seconds before I remembered myself and moved on. But I remember thinking, whoever built this did not believe it could sink. That was the feeling the ship gave you. The absolute calm of something built so completely that the question of failure simply hadn't been included in its design. The second-class dining saloon was on the D-deck, running the full weight of the ship, oak paneling, white lining, proper silverware, menus printed fresh each day. Second class on the Titanic was first class on almost any other ship afloat. The passengers knew this and were pleased about it in the particular way people are pleased when they are getting more than they expected. My table seated approximately 40 people. I had their names memorized within the first day. You learned name fast in this work because being called by name made passengers feel seen, and feeling seen made them easier to manage and more likely to tip. There was a schoolteacher from Cornwall traveling alone to visit her sister in Boston. She ordered the same thing at every meal and apologized each time for being predictable. There was a Belgian family, father, mother, 3 young children, where the father spoke no English. The mother spoke a little. The children spoke it perfectly and translated everything. The father bore this with a dignity I found quietly admirable. There was a young couple, newly married, who held hands across the table between courses and seemed faintly embarrassed about it and did it anyway. These are the people whose faces I have, not the famous ones in first class, the ones at my tables, the ones I brought bread rolls to. The crossing had been up to that point nearly perfect. The sea was calm in a way experienced sailors apparently found unusual for April in the North Atlantic, flat and dark and cold, barely a swell. The ship moved through it so smoothly that if you close your eyes in your bunk, you might not have known you were moving at all. That was Sunday, the 14th of April. I worked the dinner service that evening from 6 until approximately 10. The dining room was full and warm and loud with conversation, overlapping voices, cutlery on china, the occasional laugh rising above the rest. Moving between those tables, I remember thinking, This was a job at its best, when everything is running smoothly and the room is content and you are just quietly, invisibly useful. The bread rolled to table 7, the woman who thanked me. I moved on. Service ended, the dining salon cleared. I began the clearing up. I felt it before I heard anything. A vibration, not violent, not the enormous collision you might imagine, not something that threw people off their feet. It was subtle. It shredded through the floor, 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then it stopped. The cutlery on the tables rattled slightly. That was all. Then the engine stopped. That was the first thing that told me something was wrong. Not the vibration, ships vibrate. But those engines had been a constant presence for 4 days. A low hum beneath everything, so woven into the background of life on the ship that you would stop consciously hearing it. Then it stopped. The silence was enormous. I went up to the deck. The night was extraordinary, clear and absolutely still. More stars than I had ever seen in my life. The kind of sky you would get when there is no moon and no cloud, and the air is cold enough to have cleaned itself completely. And in that perfect sky, the ship had stopped. Ice in the water, smaller pieces close to the hull, and further off in the darkness, ships that were too large and too still to be waves. Passengers were coming up from below now, some of them unconcerned and treating it as an inconvenience, some standing very still at the railing with an expression I recognized because I felt it myself. Something was wrong. The ship did not feel wrong. It wasn't listing, not visibly damaged, not making any sound that suggested crisis. It simply sat there, stopped, in a field of ice under a sky full of stars. But something was wrong in the way you know weather is coming before it arrives. The crew knew before the passengers, not all of us, not all at once. Information moved in fragments in the faces of officers who stopped meeting your eyes when you asked them a direct question. I heard the word flooding from a stalker who came up from below with wet boots and a look on his face I will never forget. Then I heard the word boats. I helped with the lifeboats on the port side, women and children first, which in practice meant confusion and argument. Women who refused to board without their husbands, men who stepped back without being asked. Children passed over heads like passers, and very quickly it became obvious there weren't enough. I didn't need someone to explain the mathematics. 2,000 people on a ship with 16 lifeboats and a handful of collapsibles. I could see it with my own eyes. That understanding moved through the crowd like a change in temperature. The ship was tilting by now, subtle at first. You noticed it in the angle of water in the glass, in the way you had to adjust your waist slightly to stay balanced, then less subtle, then impossible to ignore. The band was playing somewhere on the deck. I heard them before I saw them, music rising up through everything else, starting almost cheerful and then slowing into something hymn-like. They kept playing through all of it, standing on the tilting deck in the dark. I still haven't decided if that was the bravest thing I witnessed that night, or the strangest. The sounds changed as the hour went on. Deep structural groaning from somewhere below, things sliding in distant rooms, the ocean, no longer outside, now audibly inside. And underneath all of it, the sound of people in the water. I will not describe that further. I went into the water at approximately 2 in the morning, not heroically. The deck simply reached the water and I went in with it. The cold of the North Atlantic in April is not something the world code covers. It is more like an instruction, every part of your body receiving the same message simultaneously. Stop, your chest locks, your muscles receive it, and immediately begin debating whether to comply. Your mind, strangely, goes very clear. -2 degrees Celsius, 15 minutes before you lose muscle control. Not long after that, unconsciousness. I found a piece of wooden paneling torn loose from somewhere in the ship, large enough to hold on to but not to climb onto, and I held it. I held it and I looked at the sky. The stars were still there, the same stars, completely, perfectly indifferent to all of it. The ship was gone by then. The bow had pulled down, the stern rising, and then the whole thing slid under with a sound I can still hear when the night is quiet enough. Then there was just the ocean and the stars and the voices of people in the water, and then fewer voices. I was pulled onto Collapsible B, an upturned raft that had floated free. 30 or so people stood on the hull of it in the dark, balancing, not speaking, waiting for morning. I stood with them. I was so cold by that point that standing was a theoretical concept I was enacting rather than a physical action I was performing. The Carpathia found us at 4 in the morning. I remember aunts pulling me over the side, blankets, something odd I couldn't taste, a voice asking something I couldn't properly hear. I remember sitting on the deck of the Carpathia as the sun came up over the Atlantic, looking at the water where the Titanic had been, which was now just water. I'm thinking nothing. There was no way inside me where a thought could find purchase. I just sat. 1,517 people. The schoolteacher from Cornwall did not survive. The Belgian father and mother did not survive. Their 3 children did. Pulled into a lifeboat by a woman they had never met. Arrived in New York speaking to reporters in perfect English while their parents were at the bottom of the Atlantic. The newlywed husband did not survive. His wife did. I read about her years later in a newspaper. Remarried. Living in Canada, described as a woman who laughed easily and didn't talk about the past. I hope she kept doing both. I went back to the sea. People always find this strange, but the sea was the only thing I knew, and staying on land meant sitting still with it, which I found I could not do. I worked ships for another 20 years, served dinners, learned names, brought bread rolls to people who were hungry, and moved on to the next table. On every ship, on the first day, I found the lifeboats, counted them, checked whether the numbers made sense. Every time, without fail, they always made sense now. After the Titanic, they always made sense. They have the second-class dinner menu behind glass in a museum somewhere. People queue to read it. Curried chicken with rice, spring labs with mint sauce, plum pudding, and wine jelly. I carried all of it. A woman at table 7 asked for a bread roll because her first one had gone cold. I brought it. She said thank you. I moved on. That is the last ordinary moment I have. I have held on to it for over 40 years because ordinary moments are the ones that don't warn you. They don't feel significant when you're in them. They feel like nothing, like just another table, just another request, just another small act of being useful to someone who needed something. And then the sheep eats something in the dark, and you never see her again. And the nothing moment becomes the moment you carry for the rest of your life. My name is Thomas Burke. I was there.